everybody. I'm Carolyn Hadlock, and this is the Eunoia podcast. Eunoia is the Greek word for beautiful thinking, and that's what the show is all about. I interview beautiful thinkers who are creatives, founders, authors, and CEOs, and I try to get inside their heads. I just talked with Hugh Weber. He's the new managing director and chief creative officer of The Great Discontent, one of my all-time favorite magazines. And the day before we chatted, we found out that he also just took over the reins at Design Observer, which was started by Michael Beirut and Jessica Helfand. Well, I'm super excited to hear about your plans, but I would love just to step back for a moment and ask you, how and when did you fall in love with creativity?
Wow, that's a fantastic question, and I think it's an important question for my origin story because, as I've said many times in many forums, I wasn't even the creative kid in my family. My younger brother Luke was the artist, the sketcher, drawer, doodler, and I was much more structured in the way I approached the world. And I think with intentionality, some of that naturally part of me. But it's definitely been a journey. So I left what I thought to be my lifelong career, started the process of leaving in 2004. I had spent from age 8 to 28 as a political consultant and community organizer, and had this very kind of visceral moment that sounds romantic, but I assure you is completely true, sitting on the White House lawn with my dad on the 4th of July. And my dad was a small town electrician, and yet had left this very tangible sense of legacy in the small towns I grew up in. Yeah. And I was sitting in that context at the pinnacle of the career that I had kind of spent much of my childhood and young adulthood building, and recognized that there were many places that I wouldn't feel comfortable going back to that I had worked. Not only had I not left a legacy, but I'd left division in my wake in some of those cases, or at least the kind of vestigial, kind of lingering effects of ambition without purpose at its core. And so, in 2004, I made the decision that ultimately took a couple of years to leave a career that had been as much identity as profession, but came back to the Midwest, came back to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and it was here that I really rediscovered creativity and rediscovered the role it had played in my life throughout my life without even recognizing it. So I looked around, having arrived here. There was no parade at the border, no kind of celebration that I'd returned. People had been going about their lives for the decade I was away, but kind of looked around and saw this group of storytellers. Some of them were filmmakers or writers. There were this group of creative professionals, designers, illustrators, this group of community organizers that had really focused on the arts and kind of cultural context of organizing, and recognized that those individuals, though critical to the foundations of community, were in fact seen as either living lives of luxury, meaning they had the wealth to be able to afford to be creative, or somehow had been categorized as lazy. That somehow that they would pass through this stage of creative work and end up somewhere where they would do more meaningful work. And it struck me that was not only a misdiagnosis of the role that creativity plays in all of our lives, but it was also an undervaluing of perhaps the key bridge builders and community weavers that exist in human society. And so I fell in love with creativity in recognizing the essential nature of creative expression, and more directly with creative individuals that identify with creativity at their core. It also coincided, and this is not insignificant, but it coincided with my daughter being born and this season of discovery of my own creative expression. So faced with both new life and ultimately the ties to mortality, I found myself exploring things that I never would have considered as a student or as a young adult. I was a student that by the time I was 10 was active in political campaigns, but more than that it was impressed upon me that I had some degree of talent that would lead me down a path of leadership. And so if we were to, hop in the truck and drive down Main Street of Millbank, South Dakota, my hometown, which is about 3,300 people, you and I would inevitably be interrupted yet today, 20 years, 15 years after leaving that world, by someone that would say, when are you running for governor? When are you running for, when are you running for office? And so my leaving the area to go to college and ultimately to run campaigns and be involved politically was a pathway that I felt was inevitable that would lead back to this region to run for office, and that would be the legacy that I would leave. And I think it was recognizing in many ways, and this did not begin in 2004, but it's where the transition for my worldview began, was that I was a terrible partisan. Yeah, my joy in the process was connecting people to purpose. So in that way, I was a mercenary, not a missionary, and that can only be fulfilling for a short length of time. And so for me, the small town I grew up in imprinted everything upon me in terms of the pathway that I was on, or rather the values that led me to the pathway I was on. Those values are exactly the same today in the context of design and creative professionals, the Great Discontent and Design Observer. The work I do today is fundamentally the same work with the same spirit, the same value structure. It's just directed towards something that I see as much more connective and generative in nature.
Well, that's so fascinating. So am I oversimplifying if I say that you were seeking something in politics that you couldn't find and really found it more in this creative expression in the space that you've been living in since 2004?
That is a fair summary. I think it was a recognition of that truth, that element was always going to be lacking. And because it was tied so closely to my identity, and I think this is where I can empathize deeply with creative professionals and designers that really externalize self-worth through their work. It had been that for me, and that was never going to be enough. And that was never going to be fully in alignment with the person that I wanted to be or the things that I really hoped to accomplish. And so I think that is a very true statement. And that's no discredit to the people working with me then or those engaged now, to those that choose to kind of work within the system of government or political work to lead change. I simply found that I needed to be surrounded by kindred spirits that saw the world as an exercise in kind of combinatorial creativity, whether that was connecting places or connecting people, connecting ideas, is the world I needed to be in, as opposed to a world of wedge issues and division and disconnection.
Yeah, that's really amazing. But I'm curious to hear you talk about the role of creativity when it doesn't manifest itself in a piece of art, and how, because that's one of the missions that I'm kind of on, is to sort of eliminate that phrase, I'm not creative, and to really sort of awaken creativity as a way and a tool to really unlock community and create connection. So I would love to hear your point of view on that for people who are not, trained as artists, but who have creative potential.
I think that was the core of the work with OTA. OTA was the nonprofit that emerged from recognizing that the creatives of this region, those that were both self-identified as creative professionals and those that maybe didn't but saw a role of creativity for them in their work. OTA was a nonprofit that was around for about 10 years. We raised a couple $1 million through grants and partners. We held dozens of events and did micro-documentary films and brought 150 influential creative professionals across disciplines to the region. The entire focus was to say this is not a leisure activity as much as it is the thing that is most fundamentally human. And I looked around with a new set of eyes in this region that I thought I knew so well. Moving back here in 2006, I looked around and saw extraordinary creativity. at least per capita equivalent to the cities I had lived in, but I would say exceeding that, because to survive on the plains, whether you're indigenous to this region or you've arrived in the last couple hundred years, to survive through the winters, to survive through the droughts, is an exercise in human ingenuity, but really creativity. Creativity, self to the planet, recognizing kind of that give and take, that exchange, that making something out of nothing. One of the heartbreaking moments of that transition period for me, I was visiting a relative, one of my aunts, and was walking up to her home and saw this incredible piece of folk art. It was a welded piece of art that had clearly been given great care, but done in really kind of rough-edged ways. But I, in the moment, could have seen that sitting in a gallery in DC or New York or LA. And when I got inside, I said, I noted the art and said, it's incredible that you collected this piece. Is it someone from the region that did the work? And she got the most baffled look on her face, which my transition from the East Coast back to the Midwest included a lot of those baffled looks. And she said, that's your grandfather's. He used to do that stuff all the time, and out in the back sheds. And we sold all of it, but that piece, when the auction happened a couple of years when he passed away. And it was this moment of recognizing that a man that I had seen so practical and so, in many ways, and I judge myself deeply for this, but so limited, had been so fruitful both in the work he did as a farmer and as a father and grandfather, but also as an artist. And that work, to me and to my family is more or less lost. Now I spend an awful lot of time celebrating, artists and creatives not too different than him.
The way you talk about it is, it makes me think that creativity isn't an outlet, but it's actually a conduit, and it comes from different places, which is really pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's a lens. I think not many people would say that they want a creative lawyer or accountant, but as someone who's been in business for 20 years, I can assure you that without my CPA as a creative collaborator as it relates to my business, I wouldn't be sitting where I am today, professionally or financially. He's a critical collaborator, and he is not in a profession where that is seen as a lens or a conduit of his work. And yet the way he arrives at the table is of a creative problem solver. Mm-hmm. And that's a deep part of our relationship together.
And I think he must love you as a client for that. And in some ways, I have some friends that are lawyers, and we've had this conversation where I think it's probably the most naturally adjacent creative field next to marketing, because there is a lot of performance and a lot of alternative viewpoints. And I like how you talk about creativity as ingenuity. That's, everybody can appreciate that across every sector. It's really when it's called creativity that it takes on a different inflection. So I agree. I talk about using it as a lens as well to look at our world differently. But I think it's fascinating. I did watch that documentary, and also the formation of Oda. I think is really
wow,
is really cool. Yeah. So I'm curious, and I know you've obviously lived in bigger markets. How much of your work is really trying to celebrate these off the beaten paths, versus the urban centers? And I ask this as somebody who's self-interested, as being from Indianapolis, and understanding all the challenges that brings with it for being seen as a creative agency in a destination that's not normally seen as a creative destination.
I think that at my core, my desire is to work with the untold stories of creatives and artists and makers and storytellers wherever they live. So I get great joy visiting Ward 8 on the south side of DC and telling stories there, because those are stories we don't hear culturally. But I think because of my lived experience, the stories of the great in-between Places like Indianapolis and Cleveland, deep affection for Kansas City and Denver and Albuquerque. These are cities that are somehow seen as being on a different tier, which I think is hierarchical by nature, as opposed to being at a different place, kind of in a ecosystem and map of creative expression. But there is a great deal of joy for me in the process of elevating creativity in unexpected places. Mm-hmm. But my heart is in those in between spaces.
I think, though, one thing that people tend to miss, and I think you nailed it because you're from there, is the survival aspect, that not only does geography not hold us back from creative expression, but it actually might make us more original in our creative expression, because there is a lot to be said for. And one of my earlier mentors, who was a creative director, used to talk about the luxury and the beauty of boredom, and how that can manifest itself in very creative ways and aspects. So I think it's wonderful that you're not only defending these spaces, but you're promoting them and seeing the beauty in what comes from them.
I appreciate that, and I think that. So, kind of a sidebar. In 2019, I was able to visit 40 cities, focused entirely on the design community of those cities. So I sit on the national board of AIGA, which is the Professional Association for Design. Mm-hmm. We are a 100-plus-year-old membership organization dedicated to professional designers. Much like many associations and membership-based entities, we, in the last decade, have been challenged by declining membership. And so the task was to explore and identify ways to both add value, but to identify trends and possibilities in those communities. And what I found was that at some kind of high level, at the superficial layer of creative expression, especially amongst professionals and design, there has developed this relatively, I hate to say generic, but sameness in the work that's being done throughout the country. And that is that I could fly into most cities, wherever they are, of a certain size, assuming they have an airport, take a shuttle to a nondescript hotel, eat a meal at a nondescript restaurant, hold a meeting somewhere and leave and have a sense of sameness of kind of culture. But the second you step off, literally in some cases, one step off that well-worn path, it is absolutely extraordinary, the local character and culture of design that is thriving in many ways, more so in the less expected places. That there's a dialect and vernacular amongst designers in places like Albuquerque and San Antonio, which often are shadowed even by Austin close by for San Antonio and certainly LA and the West Coast. Those cities are doing something wholly original that I think, to your point, is built out of persistence. So I can't agree more that these places that are Indianapolis and even significantly smaller are doing work that matches and exceeds work that we're seeing anywhere. And I think that is actually in spite of the internet. I think so much of the conversation about places in between the coasts is that the internet levels the playing field and we can work from anywhere and we can do this or that. I actually think that the internet is what kind of and digital media and ubiquitous inspiration is what creates that layer of sameness. And I think it's the self-reliance and, to a degree, some of the isolation and lack of expectation that creates the uniqueness.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that's true. So I wanted to ask you about that 40-city tour, and now I understand the context for it. Did you have any? What are your theories for the drop in membership?
Yeah, the themes that emerged as I was visiting these cities. And these were true in subpopulations in Los Angeles as much, and places like Miami, as they were in significantly smaller cities. But the themes I heard over and over again was a deep desire for belonging. Belonging as a kind of critical building block of community. It comes through trust and psychological safety and elements of identity. These are things that in becoming nationalized, you lose some of that. I think the second big theme that is deeply tied to that is proximity. And I think often we talk about proximity in terms of community being a location or a geographic element. It's about closeness, and I actually think it's much more emotional than that. I think it's much more about intimacy and understanding, which then creates those pathways to belonging. And then the third kind of pillar that I heard over and over again is this idea of influence, and decidedly different than influencers, which to me are just a smaller mass channel of communications. The idea of influence not being about power, but actually being about reciprocity. The idea that when we join a community, we have both the ability to influence how that community lives and exists in the world. And that's whether it's a physical geographic community or a virtual community of affinity or identity. We have the ability to influence it, but then we also have the responsibility to be influenced by that community.
I agree with your assessment that the internet has created more ubiquity, and it's sort of added this sort of opacity or this homogenization to our culture because everybody has access to everything. And so there is a rewilding, if you want to call it that, of people with their own, local, and they're falling in love with their own backyard again. But I also like what you were talking about, that it isn't just geography, because I think sometimes, especially in the industry of marketing, it becomes about geography, and it's really not. It's really transcending that and taking community to that higher level, and how you can have affinity virtually without having to live next door to somebody. So I'm fascinated by how you are able to sort of keep both of those spheres in play, because I think that is what will make an organization like AIGA and even the Great Discontent, all these things that you're working on, a lot more relevant. Because one of the things that I'm trying to sort of poke at is this idea of lateral thinking, and why don't people in finance talk to chefs, and why don't people in law talk to choreographers? That there's so much learning that can happen across those sectors. And I'm just curious, as you were digging into the communities, were you sort of staying at that design level, or were you also spilling out into those other sectors and seeing an appetite for that as well?
I think the appetite is human. I think it's definitely, I would argue it's deeper amongst those that identify as creative by nature or by profession. But I think it's a human instinct. We have this, and maybe not universal, but certainly across sectors. And the eyes that I bring to whether it's AIGA, Design Observer, or Great Discontent, are by their nature cross-disciplinary. I don't identify as a designer. I really even, unless there's ink on my hands, don't identify as a creative, a word that bristles some designers, but a word that is more inclusive of all the different types of creativity. When I was in those cities, it was almost as likely to have someone who wasn't a creative professional, even in an AIGA context. And that may be a little bit of the reputation I bring in terms of identifying not as a designer. I bring that to the table, and maybe that attracted or created some self-selection to be there. But it is very much expansive. And where chapters are thriving, or where organizations are thriving, is when they're able to tap into something beyond their core group. And this is, so ODA was built on some deep theories of diffusion of innovation. you will develop a stale pond, whether it's a small group of 8 or a smaller city of 200,000. If there aren't bridges for ideas and pathways for people to come into and also depart the boundaries of a community, creativity will, and innovation in a more corporate speak, will start to wane and will start to dissipate in a way that's not productive. So where I saw chapters that were struggling is where there was a purity of boundary that was impermeable and really didn't allow for that expansive kind of bridge building mentality. And where it was thriving, there was a photographer and a filmmaker and an illustrator all in the same space. And that's part of how I see the work and the exchange between the two organizations that I'm now serving as managing director, the Great Discontent and Design Observer. Theoretically, these are things that ultimately need each other. You have the upcoming young creatives that the Great Discontent speaks to that are needing to understand how to navigate their creative journeys and are leaning in and connecting at a deep level. And then you have more senior executives that want to talk about and question the implications of the way they approach their work so they can move large scale systems, businesses, governments, the planet in a different direction. These things are part of the same set of spectrums. They're at different scales with different participants, but they're absolutely critical and related to each other.
Yeah. Oh, I think for sure. I'm sure you're familiar with the work that Richard Florida was doing on the creative class.
I am.
Back, yes. Maybe 15 years ago?
Right.
Maybe longer. But, this idea that these are the new knowledge workers, and these are the ones that cities will grow around, and they will form urban centers. And I was really surprised that 30% of the population self-identified as the creative class. And these were engineers, they were scientists, they were city planners. But I kind of have lost track of where his work is going now. Are you familiar with what's happening? Do you think that's still viable, or is that an outdated theory?
I think there have been challenges in terms of some of the implications of the role that tolerance plays, and it was criticized particularly as someone living in a red state as a political observation rather than a structural or sociological observation. I think the work is absolutely still relevant. He released some additional data not that long ago that I can share links to, but effectively showed that community now gravitating into some cities that are seen as that kind of second ring. The one that jumps to mind or jumps to memory is Pittsburgh, a city that has the groundings of the same elements of technology and tolerance and creative class. It has an academic side to several institutes of excellence relative to higher learning that are critical to its community foundations. And I think that serves to benefit places like the cities we live in. That there is a recognition that the hyper dense concentration, though it may increase the creative collisions of a innovative ecosystem, ultimately starts to lose some of the values of the amenities and the quality of life that are critical to attracting that same group of people. But this is at the core of what the Great Discontent seeks to address, and seeks to address it with now 8 years or 9 years into its existence, a different emerging class of creative professionals that have a sense of the Great Discontent being less about kind of minor inconveniences and more about large-scale systems that have been designed to disconnect us. The way our cities are designed, the way even professional work days and professional careers are designed, higher education is designed, access to healthcare. This is a group of creatives that are going to create artifacts, as I've said before in AIGA context. They're going to make the brochure for the bait and tackle shop, but they're also going to stay up late that night and start to figure out how we can address things like climate change. And I think that excites me in a way that I can't possibly explain. It taps into the same visceral desires and inspirations that I had as a 10-year-old, at a presidential visit. And now it is in a space where I actually believe that I'm working with people capable and enough and committed to actually solving the problems.
Yeah, I think it's funny because when I first discovered the Great Discontent probably 5 years ago, so not at its infancy, but still in its formation. And at the time obviously the title's so provocative, it's a wonderful title. But at the time I interpreted it as more of that sort of inner discontent, that restless artist. But hearing you talk about it, and maybe I misinterpreted it, or maybe that's the evolution of the title of being larger and being more about the context of where you live and play, and so it's really more about where you are than who you are. But then, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the biggest evolution. I come to the Great Discontent as a sincere, committed, and infatuated fan of the site. It's something I had followed since the beginning. I went back and figured out that interview 20 was the first interview I read, and so there are now over 300. I come to it as a fan, but I also come with it seeing responsibilities that it and its community is now capable of carrying, that are deeper and more structural and more systematic. And that doesn't mean that we won't tell the stories of a designer that has, created a beautiful set of things or beautiful set of work that has experienced kind of personal challenge within the structure of their career or creative journey. I reject the solo genius myth entirely. And so to contextualize them with the people that have influenced and been a part of their work, and then the broader kind of purpose of their work and the broader desires. And not everyone needs to enter creative work with a desire to address global challenges.
Right.
But I'll say somewhat cavalierly, not everyone needs to be featured by the Great Discontent either.
Yeah.
And so I think with the limited number of untold stories that I will be fortunate to share with the remainder of my time here, I'd like to tell stories that address deeper issues through incredible creative people that are doing truly extraordinary things wherever they choose to reside.
Yeah. Do you have a criteria for the kind of person that the Great Discontent wants to feature?
So the direct answer is that is exactly what we're working on. I think we know case by case who they are, but I think to get much more intentional about how they choose to, how we can describe them in abstract is going to be really helpful to giving more space for the audience and community to share recommendations and to nominate individuals. I think when I think of them, I think of, we've finished our first interview and photo shoot, and I think of a designer named Zykira Tucker, and she, as I was alluding to earlier, she works in the south side of DC. She is challenged by the systems around her relative to education. She is challenged by deep issues like gun violence and food insecurity. She is challenged by living in one of the more powerful cities on the planet, and despite being a couple miles away from the center of that power, lacking influence in that conversation, the things that affect her and the people around her that she loves. And yet she's designing spaces for collaboration at the neighborhood level. She's assisting in the design of programming to address things like gun violence. She is creating products that are, in my mind, incredibly sophisticated. And to ruin my punchline here, she's a sixth grader. And I spent a day with her in her neighborhood in December, and how she explains the Great Discontent is extraordinary, and I think will shift in the course of one interview the depth at which we can operate that conversation. Too often scale is perceived to only come through breadth and reach and impressions and numbers.
Yeah.
And I think what we're going to do is switch axes for a little while and focus on depth and focus on going deep with extraordinary creative minds and just as importantly, those that are taking bold action to address issues that affect them in the world.
Well, yeah, I mean, look at the number one voice in climate control right now is a teenager, I mean.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And I wonder, too, I think about what you just talked about. You need to have the sense of wonder, and that really comes from having that sort of like childlike state, and being intentionally naive so that you are open to wonder and to different ways of thinking about the world. But that's a pretty radical and pretty interesting step to make. I think that's going to, as you said, in one fell swoop, going to kind of redefine what the great discontent can mean, which I think is really exciting.
Right. That shift for me, we talked about it a little earlier relative to becoming a father, but I talk often, and I mean it sincerely, the creative director of my work, whether it's large scale projects with the Paramounts and Fords of the world, or small scale stuff back here in Sioux Falls. My now 10-year-old is as critical to my work as any of the adult professionals I work with, and that's no discredit to them. Mm-hmm. That's to say that she is actively engaged and naturally engaged in the work and asks those questions that strip away the hubris and the ego and the adultness of this work in a way that is really enlightening. I wouldn't be doing the depth of work that I'm doing without a 10 and a 6-year-old.
Well, tell me about are there any other plans you have for the Great Discontent, especially with your new news about the Design Observer? Does that change how you think about it or how the two things work together? Or I
think the near steps are looking at the model to be able to bring TGD local to take deeper dives into community. So mm-hmm. what that might look like is we come to Indianapolis for 3 or 4 days, and we interview 2 or 3 creatives and do their photo shoots, and then we do a live event that we interview a fourth, and that becomes a month worth of podcast and feature content.
Gotcha.
And it allows us both to dive deep in Indianapolis and create a fuller sense of place. And then on the Design Observer side, they have done a lot of events over the 17 years, but the last 2 years have started doing an event which really, I think, even as someone who hosted my own events for a decade, I think it's a really special event. The first year was at Yale and the second year at MIT, and there'll be an event this fall, announcement coming soon. But it's a group that is capped at 300. It may end up even being smaller than that. It is intimate. It is conversational and influential in terms of the people both on the stage, executives like the CEO of PepsiCo and the chief creative officer of Target, but as importantly and maybe even more impressively, the audience contains a similar caliber of individual. And it becomes this incredible momentary collision of ideas across industry and across geography, but all through a kind of cross-disciplinary lens of how design sees the world. I think there's a lot of design and creative professionals looking inward at their profession, their process, and that's important, their kind of context. But it's when design looks out at the rest of the world that I think it truly is transformative.
Yeah, well, you mentioned that phrase. I was going to ask you about it because everybody hates the phrase ROI. But I love how you articulated it as relationships of influence. But I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit more and how you see that manifesting.
Right. So there is so much importance placed on kind of the idea of who you know, somehow implying kind of a Rolodex version or vision of our networks. And dear Lord, Rolodex dates me even beyond myself. But the idea of a contact list as being reflective of in a corporate sense, often who had value or whose prospects were the highest. We know so much about how everything from our professional prospects to our inclination to take creative risks or smoke or gain weight are tied to the actual people that are a step more critical, which are those relationships of influence. These are the people that we know that we involve with our work, that we involve with our personal, physical, spiritual lives, that become we can measure based on who they are, who we will be. And that is not an average. That is a leading indicator. We're not the average of anyone. I don't believe that, but we are deeply influenced by those people. So a number of years ago, I asked the question of the team at OTA, if an idea were to occur to the mayor of Duluth, which is in northeastern Minnesota, if the northeast point of Minnesota had an idea, a person of influence, how long would it take to get to a kid on the skate park in Pine Ridge, which is the southwest corner of South Dakota, about as far away as you could get in this 3-state region? And we set out to map those relationships, and we developed these beautiful, they look like a seeded out dandelion, these beautiful maps of the networks of influence and relationship in this region. We determined a couple things. We could predict by looking at the visuals, kind of organizations. We could predict without them at all tied on their superficial visual level. We could identify cities, but more so we could identify some unfortunate structural trends, which we could see that those that weren't connected to the central core often were the smallest rural communities, were native nations, and really in a discouraging kind of reality for a region that I love. The LGBTQ community was also distinctly disconnected from the cores of, in this case, the creative community that OTA had been building. So we went back to the foundations of community psychology and really became fluent in that language of reciprocity, mutuality, but it all came back to that word influence. And I think it's sometimes a fruitless effort to try to wrestle back words from ubiquity, right? Like to say community in marketing has certain implications. To say influence, brings up a selfie on Instagram more than it does a critical gatekeeper in a cultural, ecosystem. But we decided that's where we had to put our flag in the ground. And so I talk a lot about the real ROI. I do a lot of workshops, just having people be conscious of that, because it's true among any individual. But if you are a creative, which means that your creative production, your creative quality is impacted and influenced by who it is that influences you, meaning that your stream of new ideas, your stream of field of view and scope of the world, your ability to make kind of uncommon connections is influenced by that group, wouldn't you want to know who they are? Like, wouldn't you want to have a sense of who those people explicitly are, so that you can both be investing in them deeply, or you can be expanding that group or changing it? And so I did the exercise real time in front of a group. I had just said out loud, I wanted to be healthier. I wanted to be more physically active, and I wanted to be healthier. And we mapped it out and recognized that literally no one in the 10 names I wrote down work out or eat discernibly healthy.
Wow.
And so
that's a revelation.
There's no one to hold you accountable. When you go out to meals with these individuals that are so important, there's no one to say, like, do you really need a second dessert? There's no one to say, let's go for a walk instead of doing a sit-down meeting. And so to recognize that moment and to begin then to identify people that may be a couple of ripples out. Maybe they aren't in that core group, but they're an acquaintance or they're even a good friend, and to be able to bring them into that circle with intentionality is an important part of the process.
Yeah, and is that connected to I wanted to hear you talk about as well the 3 degrees of influence?
It is. That language comes directly from an academic who we were able to, during the time when we were mapping the OTA region, we brought Dr. James Fowler to Sioux Falls. It ended up he had this romantic backstory with his wife, and knowing that the first time he knew he loved her was here in South Dakota. So it was the stars were in alignment. But Dr. Fowler and his partner on the book Connected, another academic named Nicholas Christakis, wrote about that idea of 3 degrees of connection.
Yeah.
It's both alarming and empowering, right? I think about it in the same way that I talk about this region, which is that the skies are so big that you can really, kind of broaden your shoulders and stretch out your arms and think in terms of kind of big possibilities. But the skies are also so big that they make you feel small.
Yeah,
and
I love that.
And sometimes that can make, that can really remind you of how limited, your space is in this world. That idea of 3 degrees of influence does the same thing to me, both in terms of who is influencing me and really thinking intentionally of, do I know who is influencing me? And by kind of reciprocity, my kids and my partner, but also who am I influencing on a daily basis? Who are the 120 kind of ripples of influence, positive or negative, generative or divisive, that I'm sending out into the world? And this isn't, I often want to say, this isn't like new agey kind of cosmic BS. This is measurable science. This is a reality of my health is directly tied to the health of those that I love and that they love.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Are you finding what you're talking about in your message, is it resonant with the business leaders and the civic leaders of our cities?
So I don't know how to say this without the ego that is absolutely kind of tied to it. So I'm just going to run at the discomfort. I spoke about this at length at the Design Observer Conference at MIT last fall, and in a mind-blowing way that was beyond unexpected, it was the only standing ovation of the day. And I think it's not about me as an imperfect messenger. I think it's about the resonant truth of what's baked into it. It's the idea that we know at our core that it's easy to say when we see something wrong in the world that it's a breakdown of the system or it's a breakdown of design. But if we're honest with ourselves, especially as designers, we know that the systems are by design. And so I think that when we start to see our connection and culpability and hopefully accountability to those systems and to the possibilities of change or redesign, it's impossible not to have a visceral reaction to that. And I think that's the response it gets in those audiences. And we know, there's some other just real great data that's come out of business schools that makes it helpful to communicate. We know that, for example, if someone knows the basic terminology and structures of a network, this means they understand bonds and bridges, nodes and edges, some really 101 level stuff. It's something like 75% higher likelihood to be promoted over the remainder of their career.
Wow. Regardless of what area they're in?
Regardless of profession, right? So they did a control group in a leadership program in Chicago, and half of them got some basic training in network theory and half of them didn't. And, is it full causality? No. But are the implications dramatic? Sure.
It's
if I know, if I know that I, as the director of an agency, say I run an agency of 100 people, and if I know that at the core that someone that is better connected to the relationships of influence, whether they are inside our agency or external, if I know that's going to lead to higher job satisfaction, likelihood to stick with it and be retained, but also creative production and creative innovation. Why wouldn't I be teaching and training them to be more connected? And that is not forced fun time. That is a basic understanding of who influences us.
Yeah. Well, I was reading something a couple weeks ago, and it was about LinkedIn had identified the number one thing that business leaders or businesses are looking for when they're hiring is a sense of creativity, which I thought was really affirming, but also really surprising, and I think that comes down with, I feel like creativity is simply synthesizing things that live in the world, but you're putting together in new ways, which is not too different from what you're talking about with network theory. So it is all connected in this sort of constellation way, but I'm happy to hear that it's being received well. because I think it's definitely, it would be nice to transcend what we do, even beyond design thinking, and into really world changing through the methods and the properties that and the platforms that you have. And bringing all of these together has to be just kind of overwhelming for you, I would imagine. It's a lot, but I mean, super exciting.
It is. I think the other thing at play with those executives is that, much like we started out talking about, the first homesteaders to come to the prairie and to the native peoples that were here before, those words of resilience and perseverance. I think executives recognize in 2020 that the only truth that they can hold on to is that they will be existing in an environment of uncertainty, and that unless they surround themselves by resilient people of perseverance, but also ingenuity and adaptation to change and ability to solve complex problems, that they won't stand a chance. And so I think when a big part of them talking about creativity is recognizing all of those skills and all of those characteristics that are critical, and I think stepping into this moment, for me, with Design Observer, with Great Discontent, with IOP, is a similar exercise. I am not known by my family, past colleagues, or anyone that's really crossed paths with me as being a terribly content person. So there's something joy-filled about owning a brand like the Great Discontent. But 2 days ago, when we announced the Design Observer appointment, I fell asleep and I woke up the next morning. The only word that came to mind was content. And it was, on a personal level, moving and emotional, but on a professional level, I think was the recognition that I will never be comfortable professionally, but that in this moment I've stepped into a space that I feel that 40 years of exploration has created a unique moment where being resilient to uncertainty, recognizing the incredible importance foundationally of connection, and being someone who can serve as a bit of a guide in that conversation. These are the moments that we find out what we were made for. And waking up yesterday morning was one of those moments. And it doesn't mean that it'll be forever, but for now, I'm just absolutely overjoyed to be sitting in the conversations and at the tables like this one with people that are incredibly talented and have a sense of much broader perspective of what the world is and what our role is in it.
Yeah. Is there any barrier that you're seeing, any kind of commonality or challenge that you're seeing, any kind of resistance from that broader world, whether it be civics or business, that is something that you want to work on right away with these two new platforms for you?
It's a great question. I think, and this is going to sound like a critique, so I want to make it as personal as I can. So I think a lot about my dad, and he was someone that was known in his profession for excellence and was known for a commitment to being incredibly ethical, and was known for striving to leave his work, things around his work, better than when he arrived. And so those truths are there for a lot of creative professionals and a lot of executives. The difference is my dad was an electrician, and not once in his professional career did he come home and fret over whether the holes could have been drilled slightly straighter or whether the light switch should have been a quarter of an inch higher. He didn't. His work was not did not externalize his self-worth, and he didn't dwell in that kind of temporary kind of emotion that can be carried over into longer term things. I think so much of the world is like that, and I think that I have often wished, there have been seasons of life where I wished I could have just done a job and at night went home and watched my favorite TV show and had a nice meal and gone to bed in a safe home with my family. That's not me.
Yeah.
I suffer from the Great Discontent personally, and part of that is because once you've acknowledged and sought to address the great content culturally and socially and globally, it is hard to find personal contentment. And so it's not for everyone to be able to take those steps. I respect a business owner that can step into their work and say, the most important thing I do is making my business thrive. I'm not going to worry about the global implications. I'm not going to worry about homelessness in the blocks around my business. I have to respect that as well, but I don't need everyone to be on board in order to do transformative things. This is the 3 degrees of influence. I just need enough people that see that and recognize that, or can be supported in seeing that and recognizing that, to make transformative change.
Yeah, no, I definitely think I see you as a catalyst. I mean, as much as I don't think you could exist without the oxygen of others. It sounds like you really enjoy the collaboration and the reciprocity, and that is very authentic. So,
but thank you so much for what you do. I think this ongoing conversation around beautiful thinking is really a special frame to explore, and the people that you've had a chance to share, I've benefited in the last several days as I've prepared for this conversation by reading the incredible conversations that have come before. So it's a lot of fun to join that longer story.
Well, I appreciate it, and like I said, I'm in my own little corner of the world trying to sort of break down the barriers and to kind of use creativity and unleash it in people who have it. I always say it's not a talent; it's really a practice. So that's been kind of this project's a wonderful one for me, because I don't really have an agenda beyond just trying to sort of get into people's heads and find out the patterns and help bring those into the world as blueprints and as algorithms and just a way to sort of influence and inspire people to do that of their own accord. So I think we're doing similar things, just in much different scale.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Thank you, Hugh. I'll talk to you later. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. And I hope you took something from it. Something that'll help you with your next meeting, next pitch, your next big project. But above all, I hope it inspires you to think strange, different, new, and beautiful thoughts. For more from this interview and other chats with beautiful thinkers, visit carolynhadlock.com to subscribe on Medium and follow @Eunoia Quarterly on Instagram. That's EUNOIA Quarterly.